Hello and welcome to the Republic of Azo. I am your host, Zacchio. Today I will be sharing my presentation from the Markets and Society conference hosted by the Mercatus Center outside DC in late October of this year. The presentation is entitled Liberalism, Power, and Society, and it was part of a panel I organized on addressing post-liberalism, mediating institutions, and the state. So it's about 20 minutes long, and I will have several links in the show notes if you want to follow up more, and I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions after you viewed it. And a note for audio listeners, there is a slideshow that you can view on YouTube. So let's get into it. In 1983, Granada Television released a 6-part documentary on the Spanish Civil War. In addition to narrating the course and background of the war, the filmmakers interviewed numerous participants from the many different factions and parties in the conflict. Seeing and hearing the elderly communists and anarchists pining for the days of the Revolution, when marriage was abolished, and the monarchists and phalangists justifying the support of Franco and or complaining that he wasn't a true fascist or monarchist, is certainly striking given everyone's advanced age by that time. However, perhaps the most relevant interview for those of us gathered here this weekend was with the only self-identified liberal in the film, Marcel Giro, the son of a factory owner in Catalonia, the epicenter of the leftist anarchist revolution. He recounts the terror that the middle class felt when industrialists began to be rounded up and summarily shot by the revolutionaries, which led to a shift in support to Franco. However, he then goes on to say, quote, "I didn't belong to this side. I wasn't an anarchist. I wasn't a communist. I was a liberal man who respected other people's ways of thinking. But on the other hand, I could never have fought on Franco's side, which was, and still is, totally opposed to my way of thinking." End quote. As we look around at the current intellectual milieu, it is not hard for us liberals to sympathize with Giro's plight. Liberalism has become a byword for out-of-touch and old-fashioned on both the right and the left, and at times we seem to be as out-of-date as the 75-year-old anarchists pining away for the Catalonian Commune. Quite fortunately, however, we are certainly a far way off from a civil war like what happened in Spain, where the mass execution of prisoners, terror, and neighbors rounding up and killing neighbors were all commonplace and carried out by all sides. However, the future is radically uncertain and impossible to predict. The world we live in now could not have been predicted by those living in 1922, just as we today cannot predict how the world will look in 2122. Fortunately, in stark contrast to Spain, liberalism, or at least a holistic form of liberalism, is deeply ingrained in the United States, and even American conservatism is ultimately a liberal worldview. If we do not wish to end up like Giro, or his other liberal compatriots who went over to Franco to avoid being rounded up and killed, we must work to advance and defend a conception of liberalism that will work to reestablish the essential pillars of social order, while also gathering the strength to defend this order. The word liberal is certainly troublesome to use, as its possible meaning has become so broad as to be rendered nearly incoherent and open to attack by any number of foes. Nearly any attack against it is true to some degree for some part of the liberal tradition. Indeed, I found myself to a large extent agreeing with many of the problems that Patrick Deneen laid out in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, especially his argument that, quote, statism enables individualism, individualism enables statism, end quote, and the woeful state of the mediating institutions of society. However, I ultimately found his attack to be unconvincing because it attacks a stream of liberalism rooted in the French Enlightenment, while completely ignoring the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment and the development of liberalism in both Great Britain and the United States. Relatedly, Eric Voegelin condemns liberalism for collapsing into permanent revolution and for undermining important foundations of society and religion and science, among others. Regarding religion, he states that the liberal view is, quote, "If only these influences, meaning dogmatism and the authority of revelation, on thinking and public life could be removed, then the free human being would order society rationally with his autonomous reason. However, if in practice Christianity is driven out of men, they become not rational liberals, but ideologues. The undesirable spiritual order is replaced not by liberalism, but rather by one or the other of the emotionally as intensive ideologies. The liberals did not foresee this, because their conception of immanent reason had already so badly deformed the image of man that the problem of the spirit and its transcendence had disappeared from the field of vision." End quote. Regarding science, he states, quote, "As far as I can judge, the concept of autonomous immanent reason causes no damage in mathematics and the mathematicized natural sciences. But in the sciences of man and society, it destroys the subject matter. For man is the imago Dei, and participates with his essence in transcendent being. If one defines immanent reason as the essence of man, ontology as the fundamental science is destroyed, and a rational social science adequate to the subject is no longer possible." End quote. This rationalism has manifested itself in bizarre ways, such as the argument that the point of the liberal program is, quote, "hyper-individualized, hyper-expanded choice over every aspect of our lives. A world where it's more possible than ever to live your life on your own terms," end quote. Under this way of thinking, the individual must be liberated from as much authority as possible, be it from family, church, or the state. However, as I previously stated, these rationalist fever dreams are not the only stream of liberal thought, though one might say they are quite unfortunately the most prevalent ones at the moment. In keeping with Deneen and Voegelin, Hayek, especially in his essays Kinds of Rationalism and The Legal and Political Thought of David Hume, recognizes the existence of extreme rationalism and lays the blame largely at the feet of Descartes, Bacon, Hobbes, and even to some extent Locke. This rationalist constructivism, which holds, quote, "that all the useful human institutions were and ought to be deliberate creations of conscious reason," end quote. Hayek goes on to state that, quote, "it is from this kind of social rationalism or constructivism that all modern socialism, planning, and totalitarianism derives," end quote, and that, quote, "it is fairly obvious that this kind of rationalism must lead to the destruction of all moral values," end quote. However, where Deneen and Voegelin stops, Hayek continues, noting that in contrast to this new reason, there stands the older tradition of humble rationalism, represented by the Scottish Enlightenment in thinkers such as Bernard Mandeville, David Hume, and Adam Smith. I would argue that the liberalism descended from this strain is not subject to the same pitfalls as its more extreme rationalist cousins, and that indeed it is part and parcel to the Anglo-American conservative tradition. Channeling Linda Rader and Paul Cliture, I would contend that not only is Hayek a Burkean, but that Burke himself is a liberal. Even Russell Kirk, at least in the earlier editions of The Conservative Mind, stated multiple times that Burke was both liberal and conservative, going so far as to state, quote, "Burke was a liberal because he was a conservative," end quote. With Adam Smith stating that regarding political economy, Burke was, quote, "the only man who, without communication, thought on these topics exactly as he did," end quote. The more astute of the anti-liberal right have recognized this fact and cast aspersions on Burke accordingly. Now that I have briefly made the argument for a more humble and non-revolutionary liberalism, I want to discuss some of the implications of what this means and how there is a need for a liberal social anthropology, and how this social anthropology is crucial for understanding current social strife, and how this social anthropology can help create a liberal vision for social harmony. First, it is necessary to address the issue of individualism. One of the first things that both critics and defenders of liberalism associate with it is individualism. There is immense emphasis on individual rights, and even if one does not descend into the depths of Randian madness, the overall anthropology is rooted in atomism. The individual is the only unit. While we do not have the time today to fully explore this subject, I would posit that a humble liberalism is much better suited for being rooted in personalism rather than individualism. In short, personalism recognizes that individuals, as conceptualized by the French Enlightenment and its offshoots, do not exist. In the words of David Walsh, quote, "The focus on individual rights may have suggested an atomistic existence, but the web of interdependence making our lives possible constantly refutes that impression. We are scarcely capable of becoming persons, acquiring the awareness of our distinct selves, except in relation to others. There is, in other words, no such thing as a self pure and simple, without the hyphenated relation to the body and world of others. The imperative of a more personalist account is one of the fruits of the centrality of the person within liberal rights. The turn towards the person has generated a personalist response as one of the most primitive alternatives to the regnant individualism of our discourse." End quote. Perhaps a helpful way of conceptualizing the difference between an individualist versus a personalist account is in the personalist's rejection of the Cartesian idea that I think, therefore I am, which is an entirely atomistic conception of existence. Personalists like Walsh would argue that a being is not capable of even recognizing the I that thinks until one has become conscious of the I that exists in the other, and in doing so, the other becomes part of one's own being. An infant does not become conscious of his own existence in a vacuum, but only through relating with others. In fact, we know from cases of feral and isolated children that the lack of human contact and relation delays or altogether stymies one's human development. Personalism is often associated with Roman Catholic thought, but quite fortunately in recent years there has been some scholarship integrating liberalism and liberal economics with the personalist account, notably the work of David Walsh and Father John McNerney's book Wealth of Persons, which draws heavily on the Austrian school. In contrast to state-of-nature theories where atomized individuals come together to form polities, a personalist account recognizes that little of this social context is decided by conscious choice in a rationalist constructivist manner. Much in the same way that a person is born into a family outside of their control, the framework of law that forms the common good is, quote, a given social order that no one has created and no one has the authority to alter at will, end quote, to quote Linda Rader. This spontaneously ordered law is not the same as legislation, which seeks to achieve a specific end. True law, in the Hayekian sense, exists in the minds, both conscious and unconscious, of the people in the specific society. In other words, the framework of the common good is written inside of persons. A person is not only born into a family, but into a shared manifestation of what the common good is. In Walsh's words, quote, individuals do not generate the polity. They have been generated by it, end quote. We take this detour into personalism to establish the importance of the communal groups through which humans actually live their lives. Because persons are relational, they are, in a sense, both themselves and not themselves. They are unique, but they are also a product of the mutuality of persons. A person is both an individual and something more. By virtue of our shared community, I am in you, and you are in me, in a reflection of the Christian Trinitarian relation, which is mentioned by Jesus in his prayer in John 17. Quote, I in them, and thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one. End quote. This understanding is not only necessary from an ontological perspective, but is essential for better understanding how liberalism can work to uphold the social order and stave off its fracturing and collapse. Perhaps the most visionary thinker in this regard is the mid-century sociologist Frank Tannenbaum, particularly the framework he establishes in his essay, The Balance of Power in Society. In brief, Tannenbaum argues that there is a fixed amount of social power in society, and that this power is exercised by social institutions carrying out their proper functions. When these functions are encroached upon, one institution gains power at the expense of the others, and social disharmony is the result. In Tannenbaum's words, quote, society is not completely malleable to the hand of man. On the contrary, society is possessed by a series of irreducible institutions, perennial through time, that in effect both describe man and define the basic role he plays. Man, as we know him, is therefore not merely the product of society. He is the very child of a complex institutional system that conditions his survival and sets the stage for the drama of life itself. These institutions, prevailing through time, manifest themselves in almost infinitely variable forms, but always fulfill the same role, the structuring of incommensurable human experiences. End quote. Tannenbaum broadly classifies these perennial institutions as the family, the church, the state, and the market. The key point is that these institutions, when properly carrying out their functions, establish existential meaning, order, and security in the lives of those who participate in them. Tannenbaum notes that these institutions are inevitably always in conflict with one another because their claim is totalizing on the person. Each strives to be considered what Nisbet would call someone's primary social reference group. However, this conflict does not result in total war and the breakdown of the social order, because in a healthy and balanced society, a group's members are not siloed into one group or another, but rather exist as members of all of them simultaneously. There will inevitably be conflicting visions and jockeying to secure power within society by the various institutions. But Tannenbaum is clear that this is not a fluke, but rather an essential component of life itself. In his words, quote, conflict is part of the process of institutional life itself, and the end of the conflict would really signify the end of life itself. End quote. He attacks dialectical theories of class struggle, which results in some end state of, quote, eternal rest, that is, death, end quote. Social strife is natural, but not on an existential level. When no group can destroy the other and achieve some final victory for all time, compromise and coexistence becomes the norm. Tannenbaum lays out what might be considered the liberal vision. Quote, in a well-balanced society where the institutions keep each other in check, man lives in comparative peace. His great problems are relative. His conflicts are over details, and the opponents live together as friends, belong to the same club, go to the same church, and marry into the same families. End quote. There is balance and a Zen-like harmony. However, when one institution begins to lay claim to the functions of the others, the end result is disharmony and insecurity. In a harmoniously ordered society, each institution shields members from predations by the other. But when one, in our current era, the state, begins to centralize social power by stealing the proper functions of the others, the balance is destroyed, and persons in turn become mere individuals at the mercy of the state. This in turn leads to a security dilemma, which one might characterize as offensive realism and the tragedy of great power politics applied on a domestic level. The centralizing and domineering state has become the nuclear weapon, and everyone is motivated for their tribe in the most vulgar and unintegrated sense, to control it, lest the other side have it, and they be powerless and at their mercy. Tannenbaum vividly describes the end result of this imbalance, which quite unfortunately bears such a striking resemblance to our current state of affairs as to verge on the prophetic, and I shall thus quote him at length. Quote, "As soon as one of these institutions, be it the state, the church, the family, or the economy, becomes so strong as seemingly to threaten the very survival of the others, then the issues cease to be petty, capable of compromise, and the arguments become preludes to civil wars and revolutions. The contentions between the partisans of one or another institution take on an ideological character. The contrasts between them seem absolute, and the petty quarrels become symbolic of the greater conflict. People begin to talk as if the end were in sight, as if doom were awaiting them at the next turn, and hope of peace, the older peace, fades, and with it tolerance, gentleness, and human sympathy. Life ceases to be important or to have any special value. The cause, whatever it may be, or whatever its name, takes precedence over all else, and men make ready for death, either their own or the death of their enemies, as if the earth were not sufficiently broad to contain them both. Civil war and revolution come almost as a relief, for now it seems that the issues will finally be settled for all time. In that situation, there is no compromise, and rebellion, revolution, and civil war are a logical, inevitable, and supposedly necessary consequence of the claims to absolutism in the name of one of these institutional interests. What a bleak picture that strikes far too close for comfort to our current social situation, though, I would add, that thanks to America's inherently federalist character, we do not seem to be too far gone to pull back from the brink. This brings us to the final point I wish to make today, which is the need for liberals to recognize the importance of power in the defense of a liberal society. Richard Wagner establishes a useful distinction between sentimental liberalism, where, quote, human governance could be reduced to ethics, law, and commerce, leaving no room for the political insertion of force into society, end quote, and muscular liberalism, which recognizes that, quote, free societies are not self-sustaining and can degenerate without the proper use of force, end quote. Wagner bluntly notes that guns and the ability to threaten to use force are what lead to a balance between different factions within a society. And while this is true, guns and outright violence are the appeals of last resort. Tannenbaum draws an important distinction between strength and power. It is true that guns provide strength, but that strength cannot always be manifested into power. The family and the church are not powerful because they can call on armed hosts. They are powerful because of their authority and the existential role these institutions play in shaping their members' lives and outlooks. A liberalism that seeks to tear down all authority is a liberalism that will ensure the triumph and domination of the state, or perhaps in the future mega-corporations. A liberalism that seeks to restore proper balance to society by working to facilitate each social pillar carrying out its proper role and defending that balance is a liberalism that stands a chance of enduring the test of time and preserving the social order upon which civilization itself rests. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Republic of Azo. Be sure to subscribe and check out all the links in the description below. Thanks, and have a great day.